Only in America.
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 Welcome to Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. Children fleeing Central America have experienced some of the worst violence in the world. And then, as we have seen, heard, and read, these same children face additional trauma in detention centers on our side of the border. For the rest of their lives, how will that trauma affect these young people? And what can be done about it?
I know that trauma doesn't leave, doesn't disappear. And I think that that's part of the reason that it's, part of what should motivate all of us to take action, is because we know that the effects of what's happening today can be transmitted across generations in any number of different ways. What I would say is, I'm here for you, we're here for you, and we'll do everything we can to help you and your family reunite.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani. To experience violence, poverty, extortion as a young person shapes your life. And for any rational parent, this experience would lead them to do anything they can to seek safety, including migrating across entire regions. And after this journey, long, hard, arduous, for our government to take these children from their parents causes even greater trauma. That's a lot for anyone to handle, especially young children. As psychologist Luis Zayas put it in his TED Talk, psychological trauma affects children's developing brains. And he's seen the way it emerges for refugees and asylum-seeking children at the U.S.-Mexico border.
Desperate parents with children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras who only want to bring their kids to safety and security. They are fleeing some of the worst violence in the world. Tonight I want to tell you that children in immigration detention are being traumatized. And we are causing the trauma. We in America, and actually those of us here tonight, will not necessarily be on the same page with respect to immigration. But I think we can agree that America should not be doing harm. The government, the state, should not be in the business of hurting children. It should be protecting them, no matter whose children they are.
The fact is, our immigration policies are neglecting children's physical and mental health. Zayas goes on to explain the effects on children, including a weakened immune system, chronic illnesses, night terrors, depression, anxiety, suicidal thinking, and post-traumatic stress disorder. He makes the case that we need to replace fear and hostility with safety and compassion. Even pediatricians are warning against the administration's long-term impacts of their family separation and detention policies. The American Academy of Pediatrics president, Dr. Colleen Kraft, wrote in a recent Los Angeles Times op-ed that breaking up families causes irreparable harm and toxic stress to the children impacted. Dr. Kraft wrote, "The government's practice of separating children from their parents at the border counteracts every science-based recommendation I have ever made to families who seek to build and not harm their children's intellectual and emotional development." Let that sink in. We, as the United States, are impairing children's current conditions and their future. In essence, their shot at a better life. And the consequences are long-term. Generations to come will be impacted by what our nation has done today.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
We don't often think of trauma in terms of something that persists for years across generational lines. But as author and former speechwriter for President Obama, Frankel discovered, it often doesn't just end with the person who suffered the trauma. Adam is the author of the new book, The Survivors, a story of war, inheritance, and healing. In his book, Adam describes his family's journey from Holocaust Germany to America, sharing incredible personal stories of the way intergenerational trauma has shaped his identity in the ways that he has never expected. A lot of what he learned and shares applies directly to what asylum seekers at our borders are facing now, and will may continue to face into the future if they aren't protected with the care that they need. If, as a nation, we can confront the trauma that migrants are facing, we can rewrite the script for future generations. Adam, thank you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, first of all, the book is incredible. I've really, really enjoyed reading it, getting to hear your story. But my first question is, why did you write it?
So thank you for saying that. I had to write this book. I started, when I left the White House in 2011, I started with an idea of writing about my grandparents' journeys, the two on my mother's side who survived the Holocaust, and then two on my father's side, who World War II veteran, and my grandma. But at the same time, as I started writing that and thinking about that book, I was going through just personal experience that I was grappling with, this sort of this revelation of my dad is not my biological father. And so as I started processing that, what I realized was that writing about it would help me manage it. And so I don't think I realized that at the outset when I started writing the book, but as I started writing about what had happened and trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it, I quickly came to realize that writing this book was really my only way through it, and my only way of wrapping my head around some of these family revelations that had kind of rocked my world. So it's a book that at times, to be honest, like I didn't want to write it. It was very painful to write. Parts of it, I mean, I had to step away from writing it for hours or sometimes days at a time. But now on the other side of it, I can see how important it has been to my own kind of healing process.
Why did you call it The Survivors?
I call it The Survivors because I think that anyone who has survived trauma, and there are all kinds of trauma, whether it's combat and war, whether it's mental health issues, whether it's cancer, whether it's racism, there are all kinds of trauma. But we talk about survivors of trauma. And so as I was thinking about my family and the story I tell of intergenerational trauma, I started thinking about the different generations of survivors. And, you know, it's not just a story of intergenerational trauma that I try to tell, it's also a story of intergenerational healing. And so I talk about my grandparents who are Holocaust survivors. I write about my mother who's struggled with depression and mental health issues, and frankly, inappropriate relationships with my biological father, one of her professors in grad school had with her, that she's a survivor of, in my view, and sort of the experience that I've had to grapple with. So that was why I called it The Survivors, that all of us who've experienced any form of trauma, I think in one way or another, are survivors.
So I don't want to, by any means, equate the journey and what your family has gone through to what immigrants go through today.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they're two very, very, very different experiences and realities. But I mean, as I was going through it, what I took away were kind of three buckets of thought buckets, if you will. Migration, identity, and trauma. So let's start with migration. As you were learning about your family's story and you were learning about their migration story, what surprised you?
I was surprised by a number of things. I mean, there were details that surprised me. You know, frankly, the horror of my grandmother's experience. In our family, the male experience was prioritized. I don't know that all my family would characterize it that way, but I will. Which is that my grandfather was a Dachau. Everybody in our family and beyond in that community knew him as a Dachau survivor. And my grandmother never talked about her experience.
I remember this. I think you had asked her when she...
I asked her. She never talked. She was too traumatized. She never talked. Really, I mean, a few words here and there. We got glimpses of it, but... And I think there was a gender component too, as well, because my grandfather, you know, he was fixing watches for his Nazi guards. There was a sort of heroic story, and my grandmother, we didn't know what her story was. And in any event, as I sort of started getting into it and learning as much as I could through interviews with others and historians' accounts of where she was, you know, and thinking about her as an adolescent girl hiding in walls while Nazis stuck bayonets into them, The one or two times I asked her about it, her just, crying, it just broke my heart even more. So that's one of the things I think that surprised me, just learning my family's story. And my grandfather's was more familiar to me, although I learned a lot of new details. But that was one of the things that was horrific. I think I also learned just the extraordinary resilience of these people, that even those who were so deeply traumatized, like my grandmother, who had nightmares until her final days. When I was a kid staying at her house, I'd wake up early, and she was in the kitchen making orange juice for me, and I thought, oh, she likes to wake up early and make orange juice for her grandson. And it was only much, much later that I learned that she never slept through the night because she would wake up screaming her sisters' names. My uncle told me all of her sisters were killed. But even that, this is a woman who persevered, that even the ones who were so, and everyone was so deeply traumatized who experienced something like that, the resilience that they had to just keep moving forward, to come to this country, try and build a new life. And, I hear what you were saying about not wanting to draw too close comparisons. And I do think that, we get into trouble when we start equating experiences and saying one trauma is better or worse than another. One can't do that. We have to kind of look at them on their own. But, I can't help but see some of my own grandparents' experiences and some of my family's story in the stories of migrants who are coming to this country today, trying to come to this country today, and all that they are enduring. I mean, you think about what they're enduring just to try and get to this country. Not to equate them, but that is the story of generations of immigrants who've experienced their own hardships, challenges, whatever that is, to come here.
So as I was getting ready for this conversation, I was going through the New York Times, the article by Miriam Jordan, and she has been following a family of refugees from Rohingya. And it's an 11-year-old boy who's now 14 who is in a foster home in Michigan. And the organization that's been helping him is Bethany Christian Services, based in Grand Rapids. And I think the quote was that he says that this young man, this young boy, adolescent, has a sense of survivor's guilt because he wants to get his parents here, but he probably won't be able to. So let's say you're sitting across the table from him, based on what you've learned about your family. What do you tell him?
Well, I think the first thing as I think about that question, I haven't been through this experience, and I've experienced it from the perspective of the offspring of those who've experienced it. And I don't know what it's like to be separated from my family. I do know that from knowing my family's story and knowing my grandparents and the impact that their trauma had on them and their children and on my generation, I know that trauma doesn't leave, it doesn't disappear. And I think that that's part of the reason that it's, part of what should motivate all of us to take action, is because we know that the effects of what's happening today can be transmitted through the cross generations in any number of different ways. And I think if I were sitting across from him, what I would say is, I'm here for you, we're here for you, and we'll do everything we can to help you and your family reunite.
Because that was one of the things that you wrote about in the book that to me was very surprising, is the idea of intergenerational trauma and that sense of resilience that's passed on through generations.
Yeah.
What was the science behind that?
Yeah. It's fascinating, this sort of whole topic and conversation about intergenerational trauma. I think intuitively it makes sense to all of us in our own family experience. Every life or family has experienced some form of trauma. And so I think all of us understand in some way that this trauma can be passed down.
But very few of us ask about it.
Very few of us ask about it. And I can say firsthand that it's not always, it comes with some challenges when one starts asking questions. So what we know about the science of intergenerational trauma stems largely from the aftermath of the Holocaust, because what we found was in the 1960s, a lot of Holocaust survivors' children started showing up in clinics, presenting a whole number of different symptoms. And the people who saw them, the researchers and physicians, started wondering what was going on. And so fast forward a few years, and you see more organized efforts to treat Holocaust survivor children. And fast forward a few more decades, and what you have is a body of research that has tracked the different ways that trauma can be passed from one generation to another. So there are different ways of looking at it. First of all, I should back up and say in this country, often when we think about this, we have to think about what it means for the Black community and Native American community. And so there's a professor at Harvard Medical School named Alvin Poussant, who wrote a book with Amy Alexander where they talked about post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And in the Native American community, people talk about the soul wound, the legacy of the genocide, and the way it has contributed to a host of challenges in those communities. And so there are a number of ways in which the trauma can be passed down. I think that there are sort of family behavior ways, so that people who have experienced the trauma, they then react in certain ways in their own parenting and in the way that they raise their children, which kind of perpetuates the legacy of that trauma. Maybe it's penchant for violence. Maybe it's rigidity. Maybe whatever it is. There are a whole bunch of different ways, and people who've looked at Holocaust survivor families have kind of broken out the different ways that Holocaust survivor families have responded and the likelihood of the different responses to perpetuating the trauma. There's also, in recent years, a whole new emerging science that has looked at it at the genetic level. So, in particular, when it comes to an emerging field called epigenetics, the epigenome is sort of a layer of information that sits on top of the genome. And we know that it is affected by external factors. So it's affected by the environment, right? Pollution, and it's also affected by stress and trauma. And so what researchers who've looked at this have found is that the same sort of epigenetic markers that the parents who experienced the trauma had can also be found in the children. So Holocaust survivor offspring, they're called, children of Holocaust survivors, were found to be 3 times more likely to experience PTSD if exposed to a traumatic event than similar, folks who were Jewish whose parents were not Holocaust survivors. Babies born to women who were at or near ground zero on 9/11 were found to have the same sort of levels of low cortisol, which is a stress hormone, as their mothers had. And so what we're starting to see is an emerging science around how it affects later generations. Now, there is a lot of debate about how it's transmitted from one generation to another, because you need multiple generations in order to actually show that it's directly inherited. But without a doubt, the trauma of one generation is identifiable in the genetics of later generations.
So then, going back to your previous job in terms of kind of communicating policy, right?
Yeah.
For President Obama. Think ahead 5-10 years and the way that migrants are treated these days. So that Honduran family coming from Tegucigalpa, maybe they're an economic refugee, maybe they're fleeing persecution. What are the types of programs and policies that we need to be thinking about now to maybe not mitigate, but at least to better understand what intergenerational trauma looks like?
Yeah, it is such an important question. As a former New York City health official said to me, he said, we now have more evidence about the harm and the dangers that trauma can do, both in terms of creating and exacerbating health challenges for individuals, creating challenges in communities, than we did about the benefits of seatbelts when the first seatbelt laws were passed in the 1960s. So I think there are a number of things that we can do. The first thing that we need to do is just talk about this stuff more openly in families and communities as a country. There's still so much stigma associated with mental health issues and the way trauma can affect individuals' life, families' life, communities' life, that I think just surfacing that, talking about that is an important first step. More broadly, look, clinicians often think in terms of prevention, treatment, and recovery. And so in terms of prevention, there's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test, which looks at a whole bunch of indicators for traumatic incidents that people experience when they're young. And they're correlated with all kinds of health issues much later in life. And it's an important screening test to see who's most at risk, because people respond to trauma differently. And so I think that's an important screening test that people who have been exposed to trauma, have experienced and endured trauma, should take to help public health officials, to help medical professionals kind of assess what to do. So that's important. In terms of treatment, I think that one thing we need to do is adequately fund and staff mental health care in this country, which is the 4th largest bucket of healthcare spending in the United States. It's currently underfunded, it's currently understaffed, and it's no wonder that a lot of these issues go unaddressed. In terms of treatment, there's also something called expressive writing, which is a technique about just writing down feelings and thoughts that are weighing on us. And there's extraordinary research around the physical health benefits that can accrue from doing this. In one study, the symptoms of cancer were actually mitigated through expressive writing. It's very powerful. I found just by writing this book that the feelings that I had experienced grappling with the trauma in my own family's past, all of that was mitigated through the process of writing. So I felt that profoundly over the course of writing the book, and I urge anyone who's grappling with their own challenges to try that. I think it may help. And then in terms of recovery, I think, look, one thing we need to do is make sure we're not re-traumatizing people, that if there are families, for example, that have been separated and then reunited, that we're not re-traumatizing them by, putting them constantly under the threat of separation again through deportation, that we're not constantly re-traumatizing them with other kinds of anti-immigrant laws. And so there's just a host of good public policy that, by the way, most Americans agree on, that needs to be put in place in terms of immigration, in terms of the economic opportunity, in terms of education, to ensure that folks are not re-traumatized, again, that they actually have a path to more opportunity and a better future for themselves and their families.
Another big part of the book is identity. You mentioned earlier finding out your story from your father, but also the identity of the family over the course of generations. What was that like to go through, to learn about, the name change, et cetera?
Yeah, so, I grew up with one secret that I was aware of and another that I was not aware of until much later. And the secret I was aware of was that my middle name, my mother's last name, was not our own, that it had been bought in a refugee camp in Germany after the war. I think bought, I don't know. I don't know how exactly
it does sound like a pretty interesting phone call.
Yeah, yeah. My grandfather was always shady with the details, and very deliberately so. But the family was terrified that this would be discovered. Initially I thought he was terrified because, he's afraid to be deported. And for a long time growing up, I couldn't understand that. I think that fear would probably be more understandable in today's climate. But, for a long time I didn't understand that, but eventually I sort of came to the view that this man has experienced his government actively targeting him. So who am I to have any questions about that? But that, what he was actually afraid of was German reparations payments being on the line because we've benefited, our family, he and our family have benefited from German reparations payments. And so that's why he so, relentlessly guarded that secret. I'm very proud of that. I think it's a testament to his survival. And it's such a common story among immigrants today and through all time, changing names to get in, doing whatever they need to do to make a better way for their family. That's like, that's one of the things I admired most about him. And then I much later learned, shortly before joining the Obama campaign as deputy speechwriter in 2007, I learned that my dad is not my biological father and that this was a secret that my mother kept from me, from my dad, and from both sides of our family. And, that secret totally unraveled my world when I learned it. And it took me years, and it took me writing this book to help process and move on from that. But one of the things that I kind of noticed or observed as I was doing so was just the way, as your question raises, that identity has played itself out through my family's story, because not only is my last name, in a way, not a last name. I mean, my last name, Frankel, is not the last name of my biological father, and I was never adopted. But my middle name, Parisman, was bought or stolen or whatever in a refugee camp, I joked with my wife that I want her to start calling me Adam, just like, Prince or something, or like Madonna. I'd just go by Adam. But it does raise all these sort of questions, and it kind of forces you to figure out what matters to you, who you are, because the name, I think the truth is, with the exception potentially of British royalty or people who can track their lineage or something through, which not a lot of us can. Who knows how many times names have been changed? And, identity is such a complicated mix of things, and we're only beginning to learn just how complicated through sort of 23andMe kits and Ancestry.com kits. And but it is definitely, I have, over the process of learning about my family story and my own kind of journey with this, I've had sort of a ringside seat at the complexity of identity and the way it morphs and evolves through generations, and also the weird symmetries of the name change and my name not quite being my name, and the way these things kind of play out from one generation to the next.
So what are the 3 questions somebody should ask their parents, their grandparents, after you're going through this process? You know, okay, these are the 3 questions everybody should be asking.
It's dangerous. I don't know that I would encourage everybody to ask these questions. You never know what the answers are going to be. And I say that sort of jokingly, but if there are listeners who, look, it's always worthwhile to understand your family's history and your family's story. I think that without a doubt, I have understanding my grandparents' experience and my family's story has just meant a lot to me personally, and just helped situate me and our family in the sort of broader story of this country and the past 50, 70 years. 80 actually now, since the start of World War II. And I think that's always worthwhile and important, because I think it helps us, anytime we can situate ourselves in history, I think it helps us widen our aperture and understand the bigger picture, and maybe gives us a better lens through which to look at things that are unfolding today. As far as anyone who might actually have doubts about who their father is, if you are feeling those doubts, it's a very personal decision about whether you want to explore that. And I think that I was somebody, I needed to know the truth. I couldn't not know the truth. I don't know that everybody would feel the same way. I can certainly say that either way, if you're inclined to explore it, just be prepared. And that learning the truth is not the end of the journey. Learning the truth is the beginning of the journey. So you think the beginning of the journey is asking the question. The beginning of the journey is getting a certain answer to that. And it can be long and painful working through that. So I think it varies for everybody, but proceed with caution.
A warning, not a series of questions.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah.
So last question for you.
Yeah.
Name of the podcast is Only in America. So as a speechwriter, this should be a home run for you.
Mm-hmm. We got to lower expectations
right,
a little bit here. Yeah.
Only in America, ...
Only in America, only in America could a young man who survived the Holocaust open a watch repair shop in New Haven a week after arriving in this country, raise a family with his Holocaust survivor wife, and then many decades later show up in the Oval Office to meet, Barack Obama, who his grandson was serving as a speechwriter. That's our Only in America story.
Thank you. Migration, whether it is by choice or by force, is a traumatic experience. How families understand that trauma shapes generations. How communities help generations of immigrants integrate into society shapes nations. Adam Frankel is the author of The Survivors, a story of war, inheritance, and healing. You can find more information on Adam at our website, immigrationforum.org. And while you're there, if you like what you heard today, subscribe to Only in America on your favorite podcast platform. Only in America is produced and edited by Emily Chow, Joanna Taylor, and Megan Wetmore. Kathleen Farrell is the executive producer. I'm Ali Nirani. Thank you for listening to Only in America, and I will talk to you next week.